Erev Shabbat Shalom Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Bava Metzia. We are up to Perek Hey Mishnah Zayin. Today's Mishnah should be Le'elu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Ranbai V'Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Chana bad Miriam Sasom ben Ryan Yoshua ben Shifra Menuchatam beGan Eden Amen and Le'avdi ben Chaim Lechaim v'Derefua Shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa Betok Shah Chole Israel and Achlama Mera Binyamin Old Zion Chai ben Dvorah. We learned in Mishnah 1 that it is forbidden to pay in advance for merchandise that will not be delivered until a later date because its price might go up before it is delivered and the buyer will end up getting more value than he paid for. This resembles interest on a loan because it looks like the seller is giving more in exchange for being allowed to use the money he was paid in advance. Since the seller has the use of the money before he gives anything in return, the money is considered a loan. The rabbis therefore prohibited it. However, since the prohibition is only rabbinic, because like we learned, biblical law forbids interest on money that was loaned, the extra payment in our case, which comes about through a sale, is forbidden only by rabbinic law. Again, so since the prohibition is only rabbinic, the rabbis included several leniencies in it. One of these leniencies is that it is permitted to pay in advance for merchandise the seller already has in his possession, even though the buyer will not receive it until sometime later. This is because we view the sale as having taken place as soon as the money was paid, so the goods already belonged to the buyer before the price went up. So when the price went up, it is the buyer's goods that become more valuable, and he is not receiving anything extra from the seller. Our Mishnah discusses the law where the seller does not yet have the merchandise. And poskin ala perot, we may not set a price and pay in advance for produce that the seller does not have now, ad she'etzeh ashar, until a market price for that type of produce becomes established. When a new crop is harvested, the market price for it fluctuates until it becomes clear how much produce will be available. Once the full crop reaches the market, the price stops fluctuating and a regular price becomes established. Before that time, the seller may not be able to buy the produce for the money he receives from the buyer, and he therefore cannot be viewed as having the produce. Since he cannot be viewed as having the produce, the buyer was paying him now in advance cannot be viewed as acquiring the produce at this time. Therefore, the money paid in advance is considered a loan, and if the price of this produce rises before the seller delivers it to the buyer, the seller will be giving the buyer more than was advanced, which would be like paying interest on the loan. Yatsa Shah, once the market price becomes established, poskin, we can set a price and pay in advance, vafel pisha nazeh yesh lazeh, because even though the seller does not yet have the produce, a different person does have it. Since the seller can easily buy the produce at the going rate with the money he receives from the buyer, we consider it as if he already has the produce when the buyer pays him in advance. And since the seller, quote-unquote, has the produce, the buyer can be viewed as taking ownership of it at the time he gives the money, and this avoids the problem of interest on money paid in advance. Now, the law we just learned applies where the seller does not actually have the produce at the time he is paid in advance. If he does have it, the buyer can surely be viewed as acquiring it immediately, even if there is no established market price yet. And the Mishnah elaborates on the extent of this leniency. Hayahu techila lakotzrim, if the seller was the first of the harvesters to bring in his grain, and he already has a stack of it waiting to be processed before the grain is sold, the cut stalks are threshed and winnowed to separate the stalks and the chaff from the grain, but there is not yet an established market price for it. Posekimo ala gadish, a buyer may set a price and pay in advance for grain from that stack, even though that grain is not yet ready to be sold. The rabbis were lenient where the grain is already harvested and in the seller's possession, and allowed us to view the buyer as taking immediate ownership of the stack, even though he is paying for finished grain, not raw grain. Similarly, he may agree on a price and pay in advance for wine that will be made from a tub of grapes that the seller is preparing to press, and for oil that will be made from a vat of olives that the seller is preparing to press. Grapes were piled into a tub where they would become warm and ripe so the juice would flow more easily from them when they were pressed. Olives were similarly placed in a vat before they were pressed for oil. Once the seller has placed the grapes in the tub or the oils in the vat, the rabbis permitted us to view it as if he already has the wine or oil that will be made from them. And from earthenware vessels that will be made from the clay balls that a potter has. Pottery is made by mixing clay and water and shaping the mixture into balls, and shaping the balls into utensils. Valasid misheshik'o bakivshan, and for plaster once the materials from which it will be made has been put into the furnace. Plaster is made from limestone and wood that are burned in a furnace. The Mishnah records 3 views with regard to paying in advance for fertilizer when there is not yet an established market price for it. In earlier times, people would put straw in the street during the winter so that people and animals would trample it while it decayed. A few months later, it was gathered and used to fertilize the fields. So during the summer months, everyone had fertilizer, but during the winter months, not everyone had. The Mishnah says one may set a price and pay in advance for fertilizer all year round, even during the winter. Although not everyone has it then, many people do. So even if the seller does not have it, he can easily buy it from someone else at the price for which he is selling it to the buyer. The second view, Rabbi Yossi says, En poskin ala zevel, ele im ken hayta lo zevel ba'ashpa. One may not set a price and pay in advance for fertilizer unless the seller has fertilizer in his compost heap, even during the summer. Rabbi Yossi holds that fertilizer is like any other merchandise. If there is no established market price for it, the seller must actually have it in his possession before he can take money for it in advance. The third view, the Chachamim matirin, the sages permit paying in advance even if the seller does not have fertilizer, but only during the summer when everyone has it and it can be bought anywhere. And the Rav tells us, the halacha follows the opinion of the sages, that again, the sages permit paying in advance even if the seller does not have fertilizer, but only during the summer when everyone has it and it can be bought anywhere. The Mishnah now returns to a case in which the seller does not have the produce, but it has an established market price. As we learned, the buyer can pay for the produce in advance and guarantee that he will not have to pay more for it later if the price goes up. The Mishnah discusses what happens if the buyer is concerned that the price will go down and he will end up having paid too much for it. The buyer may agree to a price and pay in advance on condition that if the price for the produce goes down, the seller will give it to him for the better price. Literally the higher price, meaning the price for which the buyer gets a greater amount of produce. Now, this ruling implies that if the buyer does not make this condition and the price goes down, the seller can give the buyer the produce at the original higher price. Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. Rabbi Yehuda says, even if the buyer did not agree to a price and pay in advance for produce at the better price, meaning even if he did not make this condition explicitly when he agreed to the original contract, if the price went down, the buyer can still say to him, give me the produce at the lower price, or give me back my money. According to Rabbi Yehuda, every buyer intends this when he agrees to an advance contract, and it is therefore as if he made this condition explicitly. Since the seller is taking money in advance and not giving him the produce right away, there is an unspoken agreement according to Rabbi Yehuda that if the price goes down, the seller will have to give it to him at the better price. The Rav tells us, the halakha does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And that is then of Mishnah Zayin. The next two Mishnayot discuss the laws of lending a se'ah for a se'ah, meaning lending a certain amount of produce, a se'ah for example, on condition that the borrower will pay him back the same amount of produce. This kind of loan is generally prohibited, as the next Mishnah will say. The rabbis prohibited this arrangement because the price might go up between the time of the loan and the time when it is repaid, and the borrower would then be giving the lender back something worth more than he borrowed. The same prohibition applies to lending any item that gets consumed on condition that the borrower will pay back the same amount of that kind of item. If someone unlawfully made this sort of loan and the price of the item indeed went up, the borrower may not pay back the same amount of produce. He may pay back only the value of the produce as it was at the time of the loan, as Halakha says in Yoreh De'ah, chapter 162, Halakha 1. However, our Mishnah Chet begins the discussion of this subject by teaching about a case where it is permitted. Malveh Adam et arisav chitin bechitin lezera. A person may lend his sharecroppers. A sharecropper is someone who farms someone else's field in exchange for giving the landowner a percentage of the crop. A person may lend his sharecropper wheat for wheat, meaning he may give them a certain amount of wheat kernels and they will later give back the same amount, provided the kernels will be used for planting. In that case, the kernels are not viewed as a loan, but as part of the sharecropping agreement. It is customary for the sharecropper to use his own seed for planting. In this case, however, he does not have seed, so he borrows seed wheat kernels from the landowner. In return, he agrees to give him back that amount of seed in addition to the percentage of the crop that goes to the landowner. The Mishnah teaches that we do not view the borrowed seed as a loan, but as part of the sharecropping agreement. Instead of the sharecropper providing the seed and the landowner getting the usual percentage, a quarter of the crop, for example, the landowner will provide the seed and the sharecropper will pay him the usual percentage, a quarter of the crop, plus the amount of seed he received from him. But he may not lend him wheat for wheat if it is to be used for eating, because that is a real loan, and if the price of wheat goes up, the sharecroppers will be giving back something worth more than they borrowed. If the wheat kernels are not used for planting, they cannot be considered part of the sharecropping agreement, since they have nothing to do with farming the field. Rather, they must be viewed as a loan. Therefore, they are subject to the law forbidding the loan of a se'ah for a se'ah. The Tana found it necessary to teach this law for the following reason: Shaya Rabban Gamliel malvet arisav chitin bechitin nezera, because Rabban Gamliel would lend his sharecroppers wheat for the purpose of planting, biyoker v'uzlu, and he gave it to them at a high price, and the wheat became cheaper, or bezol v'ukhu, or he gave it to them at a low price, and the wheat became more expensive. Noten men kashar azol, he would take the wheat back from them only at the cheaper price, because he did not want it to look like he was taking interest. For example, if Rabban Gamliel lent them a se'ah of seed when it was worth 2 selas, and at the time of repayment the price of a se'ah had gone down to 1 selah, he would take back only a se'ah of wheat, even though its value now was only half of what it was when he lent them the se'ah. And if he lent them a se'ah when it was worth 1 selah, and at the time of repayment it had gone up to 2 selahs, he would take back only half a se'ah, which was now equal to the value of the se'ah he originally lent them. Rabban Gamliel agreed that it was not forbidden to lend seed in this way, which is why he agreed to lend it. However, to avoid even the appearance of interest, he was strict and would take back wheat only at the lower price. Since this was known to be Rabban Gamliel's practice, the Tana of our Mishnah teaches that this was not because the law is so, meaning not because Rabban Gamliel had to do so, but because he wanted to be strict with himself. The law, however, is that it is permissible to lend a sharecropper se'ah for a se'ah if it will be used for planting, and take back a full se'ah, whatever the price. If the price of wheat goes up, it is permissible to take back a full se'ah. However, if the price of the wheat goes down, it is permissible only to take back 1 se'ah, not 2, even though they are now worth only as much as the 1 se'ah he lent. Taking 2 se'ahs for 1 is always considered forbidden interest, regardless of its worth. So again, if the price of wheat goes up, you could take back a full se'ah. But if the price of wheat goes down, you can only take back 1 se'ah, not 2, even though they are now worth only as much as the 1 se'ah that he lent, because as this is in Yoreh De'ah, it discusses in chapter 162 halacha 1 that taking 2 se'ah for 1 is always considered forbidden interest, regardless of its worth. And that is on Abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have a Erev Shabbat Shalom and a Tzom Kal. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen va'amen.